Let's get this coolant overflow out of our way. 10mm socket, remove this bolt. Lift this up, slide it out of the cowl, and just flip it to the side over here. Over here by the overflow, you can disconnect this hose, and then right here, there's a clamp. You'll have to disconnect this one as well. Lift up on the tab, pop it open. Remove this hose. Now you can tilt the overflow in a way in which it won't leak through either hose connections. Then move this out of your way. Next, unplug the mass airflow sensor connector. Right over there, you'll see a hose clamp. We'll have to remove that with either an 8mm or a flathead screwdriver. Loosen up this clamp. And at the front right here, you'll see two 10mm bolts that hold on this air intake. Remove both. Pull up on this and slide it out of the air intake over here. There we go, set this aside. Let's remove this harness for the mass airflow sensor off of the shroud. Set that aside. Pop this one off too. Follow it along to the driver's side. Remove it off of here as well. And thankfully there's a lot of slack in this harness. Looks like it has some extra wires here. But just push this to the side like this. I'm going to use a bungee cord to support it out of my way. Pull this hose out of the shroud. Let's remove the rest of this intake duct from over there on the throttle body. Use a flathead screwdriver and loosen up this clamp. Then we'll pull this right off. That'll just make some extra space here. That way we can pull the radiator fan shroud out of the way. Slide this off. Set that aside. Push this AC hose off of the shroud. Straight back like that. Let's unclip the radiator hose. Use a trim tool and pop it up. Push this out of the way. Now if you follow the filler tube and the dipstick tubes, there are a couple bolts here that we have to take out. The first one being this one right here for the oil dipstick tube, 10mm socket. Take that out. Now this can move around a little bit. Try not to bend it too much out of the way. The next one that we have to remove is that nut over there. So it holds the transmission dipstick tube in. Drop a 10mm socket on there and then try to break it free. One last one to be removed is that 13mm bolt down there on that bracket, and that holds the oil filler tube. I'm going to stick my socket with an extension down in here. It's a 13mm socket, and I'm going to try and remove this one. Get that bolt out. Now we can move all of these around as we need. Okay, I'm going to separate these two. That way they can move independently of each other. And now hopefully we can get the fan shroud out. The radiator fan shroud is held on by these two 10mm bolts here. And then there are some that go straight down, two on each side. I'll show you those in a second. For now, let's get these two off. And the bolts I'm talking about, there are actually three on each side. My passenger side only has two, but there's one at the back there, one in the middle, and one right at the front here. They're all 10mm bolts, so with a long extension, I'll get those. And on this side, like I said, I have one missing, but there's still one at the front. So let's take all of them out. It's going to be really hard to show you, but I'll try my best. Take out these three bolts on the driver's side. Do the same to the passenger side. Now you can take this fan shroud, pop it back and off of the radiator. Now we just have to fish it out of here. Push the dipstick tubes out of your way. Get it past this radiator hose. Slide it up and out. There we go. And at this point, if you look behind the fan on the passenger side, right back there, you'll see the thermostat housing. So let's grab this clamp with some pliers and just try to get it off of here. It's easier to do this while it's mounted as opposed to after you take off the two 10mm bolts. Okay, if you squeeze it, it should lock in the open position. Now you can grab the hose and wiggle it to break it free and just pull it off of this thermostat housing. At this point, coolant is going to start coming out, so I'll have a collection bucket ready. Set it to the side. Now grab your 10mm socket and undo the two bolts. thermostat came out. Sometimes it gets stuck to the housing, but this one didn't. There it is. Take your new thermostat and housing assembly, and if yours comes already put together like this, that's perfect. That's what you want. And if it doesn't, or if for some reason it pops off, what you want to look for to properly put it together is that this bleeder valve here gets lined up with the cutout on the seal, and then when you put it into the housing, this notch right here needs to line up with the tab on the seal, on the gasket. So line that up and press it into place, and now it should stay on here. If you need to clean the surface of the water pump, now is a good time. Just use a razor blade. Mine is very clean, so I'm not worrying about that. Now you can take the new thermostat housing and slide it down into place. With the two bolts in, let's go ahead and snug these up. Get the hose back on here. Make sure you push it all the way so it's fully seated. And then the easiest way to release that clamp is just to give it a whack. Now we can torque those two bolts to 11 foot-pounds. There you go. Let's get the fan shroud back in. Push the dipsticks out of the way. Pay attention to your radiator fins to make sure you don't damage them as you install the fan shroud. Get all the hoses and wires and cables and everything that's supposed to be out of the way. Just get it out of the way. Now with the fan shroud in place, I'm actually not going to bolt it up to the top yet. Make sure these rubber pieces on the top lock into the radiator. That's what's going to hold it tight. And then I'm actually going to start in the bolts that connect the two halves first. There's 3 of them, if you remember correctly. There are 6 of them, 3 on each side. Kind of hard to see. Start them all on by hand. You don't want them to cross thread by accident. And now I'm going to just snug them up. 10mm socket. Okay, let's do the same to the other side. All right, all 6 are tight. Put this AC line right back where it belongs. Make sure it's out of the way of everything. Reconnect or resecure the upper radiator hose. Before we go too far, let's put this in. Make sure it's seated all the way down. Let's snug up the hose clamp. I'm using an 8mm socket. You can use that or a flathead, whatever you prefer. Just make sure it's nice and snug, but don't over tighten it. Those usually strip out and you have to replace them if you over tighten them. Before we move any further, let's resecure the fan shroud and therefore also the radiator. These 2 10mm bolts, or one right here and one right here. Snug these up. Resecure any wires. Now take your air intake and let's line it up. Make sure it slides in over here and makes a nice tight connection. Once it's in, snug up the hose clamp so that it can be secured. At the front here, there were 2 mounting bolts. Line those up and start them in. Go ahead and plug in the mass airflow sensor connector. Make sure it clicks so it's nice and secure. This is going to be kind of hard to see, but I need to put the dipstick tubes back together, which means the transmission dipstick needs to actually go over the stud of the oil-filled tube. So I unlodged the oil filler tube from the valve cover, and you want to make sure if you do this, try to get no debris in there. And that allows you to twist it in such a way. That allows you to twist it in such a way in which you can hopefully get this stud underneath. Not sure why they didn't make it a bolt, but either way, there we go. Now those are put back together, so you can put the filler tube back in its slot. Grommet in the valve cover, so there we go. I pressed that back in. Grommet's still in. Dipstick or fill tube is down. into the valve cover. Let's bolt it down. This one's not going to be easy. Let's bolt this down here. All right, let's snug it up with a 13mm socket. There we go. That's nice and snug. Up here, let's put a little 10mm nut on. Snug this up. Over here, let's reattach the dipstick tube with our little 10mm bolt. Make sure this is nice and snug. Take the coolant overflow. The hose that comes out the bottom here will go to the radiator. Slide it into the 2 slots up there. Push it all the way back. Set it down. And I'm just going to go ahead and start in the bolt. That way it stays in place here. I'll snug it up in a second. I'm going to connect the hose to the radiator. Connect this hose to the top fitting on the radiator and squeeze the hose clamp shut. If your hose clamp isn't good anymore, go ahead and replace it. Squeeze the hose clamp to lock it tight. Then there was this hose that comes from the intake / throttle body, and this goes on the lower fitting. Take the hose clamp and re-secure it. Snug up the overflow bolt. And this fitting right here was attached to this breather hose just in case it overflows or it needs to take up some air. Then this goes straight down. To fill up the cooling system, I have a spill-proof funnel. If you don't, that's fine. But this helps not only to not make a mess, but also makes this the highest point in the cooling system, so naturally air will want to rise, so it might help bleed faster. Either way, let's fill this up with manufacturer specified coolant, which if you are not sure what it is, check your owner's manual. I'm gonna go ahead and fill this up until it stops bubbling, and once it stops bubbling, I'm gonna turn on the engine, let it run with the heat on, that way it can bleed. I'll show you once the time comes, but for now, let's just fill this up and let it stop bubbling. The coolant stopped bubbling and it made a little bit of a mess from the bubbles, but either way, now it's time to start the engine, run it, and let the coolant bleed itself. Now inside the vehicle, you want the heat all the way up. Blower on low is fine, and we'll put the blower selector on vent. That way I can actually feel the heat once it starts coming through. And you want to pay attention to your temperature gauge, which is that one right there, and make sure it doesn't go above the 210 line, which is the halfway point. That's basically when it's at full operating temperature. Having said that, let's start it. Everything runs perfectly so far. We'll just let it run until it warms up, and then we'll check it. Okay, it has ran. Thermostat opened, cooling fans turned on, everything is fine. It sucked down some of the coolant, as you can see. I'm gonna let this cool down as it is right now. I'm not gonna take the funnel off, and then whatever's left in my funnel, I'm just gonna go ahead and put in my overflow and make sure that's topped off to the maximum level. And when I say maximum level, I mean up to this line right here where it actually says cold fill. Don't fill it all the way to the top. That's overfull. And then put the radiator cap back on, take it for a road test.